My name is Clara Vance. I'm 30 years old. I'm a trauma nurse. For 4 years, I came home from 16-hour shifts to a house I was paying for mortgage, utilities, groceries while my stepmother and my stepsister contributed exactly nothing. $134,000. I have every receipt. But none of that is what broke me. You owe this family your life. Your mother died because of you. My father said that at my birthday dinner. 40 people. Candles still burning. My stepmother stared at her plate like she'd rehearsed this moment. My stepsister raised her phone at my face and kept recording. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. Not in front of a single one of them. But what I did in the weeks that followed made my father call me 11 times in one night. And by that last call, the anger was completely gone. What I heard instead from a man who had never once softened in 30 years was something I still can't quite believe. He was begging, before we go any further, please hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you give this a like, good luck is coming your way. The rain had been falling since Tuesday. That was the thing about Seattle in October, it didn't announce itself the way storms did in other cities. There was no dramatic drop in temperature, no thunder rolling in from the coast. The rain simply arrived, the way a distant relative might show up on your doorstep with a suitcase and no clear plan to leave. By the time Clara Vance pulled her aging Civic into the driveway on Halcott Street, the street gutters were running fast and the maple tree in the front yard had given up its last red leaves to the dark water pooling along the curb. She sat in the car for a moment after she cut the engine. She did that sometimes, gave herself 60 seconds before walking through the front door, the way a diver might pause at the surface before descending. 16 hours. She'd been on her feet for 16 hours straight, the last 4 of which had been spent stabilizing a 22-year-old who'd gone through a windshield on I-5. The young man had made it. They usually did when Clara was the one managing the line. She had a reputation in the trauma unit for being unshakable, the nurse who didn't flinch, who could read a room full of controlled chaos and find the one thread worth pulling. Her colleagues called it a gift. Clara had long since stopped thinking of it that way. It was just the particular shape her survival had taken. She grabbed her tote bag from the passenger seat, pulled her hood up against the rain, and walked to the front door. The house on Halcott Street was a craftsman-style 2-story, built sometime in the mid-70s, with a wide covered porch and original wood detailing that had once been its best feature. Now the paint along the porch columns was peeling in long, curling strips, and the second step from the bottom gave a low groan under any weight above 130 pounds. Clara had been meaning to fix it for 2 years. She'd bought the lumber. It sat in the garage beside Arthur's tools, which hadn't been touched since he'd lost the last contractor job 3 years ago. She unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The entryway smelled of something fried bacon, maybe, or sausage, and beneath that, the particular staleness of a house where windows hadn't been opened in weeks. The overhead light in the hall was out again. Clara reached for the switch out of habit, then remembered she'd replaced that bulb already. The fixture itself was the problem. She made a mental note that immediately slipped beneath the surface of her exhaustion. The mahogany side table near the staircase, a piece that had belonged to her mother's mother and had no business being used as a mail dump, was stacked with the usual accumulation. Old catalogs, a phone charger with a frayed cord, a ceramic mug that had been sitting there long enough to leave a ring on the wood, and old property tax notices, a small tower of them, their envelopes still sealed. Clara's eyes moved across the table the way they moved across a patient intake form, quickly and with purpose, cataloging and sorting before her conscious mind had quite caught up. That was when she saw Arthur. He was in the living room doorway, and he was holding something, a thick envelope, manila yellow. The kind that came from financial institutions or attorneys' offices. He was holding it the way a person holds something they haven't decided what to do with yet, and when he saw Clara, something shifted in his face. Not guilt, exactly. Arthur Vance had never been particularly fluent in guilt. It was more like the expression of a man who had been interrupted mid-thought, and who was recalibrating quickly. "You're home early," he said. "It's 11:15, Clara said. She set her bag down by the door. "Long shift." Arthur nodded. He moved the envelope casually, deliberately, and slid it behind the stack of property tax notices on the mahogany table. The motion was practiced enough to suggest it wasn't the first time he'd hidden something in plain sight. Clara watched him do it. She didn't say anything. "There's leftover pork chops," Arthur said, already turning back toward the living room and the television that was always on. "Sloane made them." Clara stood in the hall for a moment after he'd gone. She looked at the stack of envelopes. She looked at the faint corner of yellow still visible behind them. Then she went upstairs to change out of her scrubs. She was coming back down 20 minutes later, hair damp from the shower. A cup of chamomile steeping in her hand when she stopped at the kitchen trash can to throw away the tea bag. It was full, which meant no one had taken it out. Which meant she would take it out in the morning, the same way she had taken it out every morning for the past 4 years. She pressed the bag down to make room and her fingers brushed something stiff. She pulled it free. It was a folded statement, crumpled once before being discarded. She smoothed it against the counter. The letterhead read Westfield Retirement Services, and the account holder's name was Arthur M. Vance. Clara read the balance line twice, the way you reread a word that doesn't look right even though you know exactly what it says. 0. The account balance was 0. She turned the page over, looking for something she might have missed: a footnote, a transfer notice, a record of rollover. There was nothing, just a closing summary dated 6 weeks ago, indicating the full withdrawal of $67,400. From a 401k that Arthur had spent 30 years building before the industry had quietly left him behind. $67,400. Gone. And he hadn't said a word. Clara set the statement on the counter. She picked up her tea. Outside, the rain pressed steadily against the kitchen window, and the maple tree stripped bare now tapped its branches against the glass in the wind. She thought about the overdue mortgage notice she'd intercepted from the mailbox last Thursday. The one she'd tucked into the inner pocket of her work bag rather than leave where Arthur or Sloane might see that she'd seen it. 3 months past due. She'd been planning to sit down with Arthur this weekend and go through the numbers. The same conversation she'd been planning to have for 6 months and kept postponing because the right moment never came, because Arthur met any mention of money with either cold deflection or something worse. She opened the cabinet above the refrigerator and took down the small basket, where she kept her own important papers: her health insurance card, her nursing license renewal, her direct deposit confirmation. She set the insurance card on the counter beside the 401k statement and looked at the 2 pieces of paper side by side for a long moment. She was the one keeping this house above water. She had known that for some time, in the way you know something you haven't yet put directly into words. But there was a difference between knowing a thing quietly and holding the evidence of it in your hands in a kitchen that smelled of someone else's cooking, at the end of a 16-hour shift, while the man who owed you at least an explanation watched television in the next room. Is he hiding the bills again? The question formed in her mind the way it always did, not as an accusation, but as the most exhausted version of hope. The hope that there was a reason for all of this that she hadn't yet been told, a reason that would make sense of the sealed envelopes and the vanishing money. And the way Arthur's eyes had moved to that yellow envelope and away again, fast and practiced, like a man who had spent decades learning how to look innocent. Clara finished her tea standing at the counter. She rinsed the mug, dried it, placed it back in the cabinet. She took the 401k statement and folded it carefully along its original crease, then tucked it into her work bag beside the mortgage notice. Then she turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. The house settled around her as she lay in the dark, the old sounds of it. The pipes and the wood and the slow exhalation of a structure that had been holding itself together longer than it should have needed to. Clara stared at the ceiling and listened to the rain. She thought about the yellow envelope. She thought about the number 0 printed in plain black ink on a page her father had meant to throw away. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong for longer than she wanted to count. And the part of her that had been trained to read a room full of chaos and find the one thread worth pulling, that part of her was already pulling. She just didn't know yet how much would unravel when she did. The week after Clara found the 401k statement, the rain didn't let up once. She told herself that was fine. She was used to rain. She had grown up in it, had learned to read the particular quality of Seattle gray, the difference between the soft, diffuse light of a morning drizzle and the flat, pressing darkness that meant the weather had settled in for days. She drove to the trauma center in the dark and came home in the dark, and in between she did what she always did: she held things together. A patient's airway, a family waiting in a hallway, the careful, invisible architecture of a household that would have collapsed without her. She had not yet spoken to Arthur about the retirement account. She kept waiting for the right moment, and the right moment kept not arriving. Arthur spent his days in the living room or the garage, moving between the television and the workbench, where he tinkered with tools he no longer used professionally, and Sloane moved through the house in a cloud of expensive perfume that Clara tried not to think about in terms of what it cost per ounce. Mia was in and out, always in a hurry, always carrying something: a ring light, a garment bag, a cardboard box of products she'd been sent by brands that Clara had never heard of. The house had its rhythms, its textures, its careful arrangement of unspoken agreements, and Clara moved through it all without disturbing anything. The way she moved through a trauma bay: efficiently, quietly, touching only what she needed to touch. Then she checked the joint emergency account. She did it on a Wednesday morning, before her shift, sitting at the small desk in her room with her laptop open and her second cup of coffee going cold beside her. The account had been set up 4 years ago, when Arthur had first lost steady work. And Clara had agreed, had offered, technically, had believed at the time that she was choosing freely to contribute to a shared fund for household emergencies. Her contribution was automatic: $200 a month, every first of the month, drawn from her personal checking. She didn't monitor it closely. She should have. The most recent transaction, dated 11 days ago, read WD $4,500 memo: Mia wedding photo deposit. Clara read it 3 times. Then she closed the laptop and sat very still for a moment, listening to the rain against the window and the faint sound of the television downstairs. $4,500. From an account designated for emergencies. For a wedding photography deposit for a wedding that, as far as Clara knew, had not yet been formally planned, announced, or discussed with her in any capacity whatsoever. She found Sloane in the living room, seated in the armchair nearest the window. A new coat laid across her lap, camel-colored, with wide lapels and what appeared to be genuine horn buttons. She was running her thumb along the collar, with the particular attention of someone examining something they were very pleased with themselves for having acquired. Sloane. Clara stood in the doorway. She kept her voice level. There's a $4,500 withdrawal from the emergency account. It says it's for Mia's wedding photography. Sloane looked up. The expression on her face was the one Clara had come to think of as her management face: the slightly elevated chin, the small, patient smile that indicated she found the conversation mildly tedious before it had even properly begun. Mia found a photographer she loved, Sloane said. The good ones book up fast. You have to move quickly or you lose them. That money is for emergencies. A wedding is an important occasion. A wedding. Clara stopped. Started again. Sloane. That account exists for medical emergencies, or if the furnace goes out, or if the car breaks down. Not for Clara. Sloane's voice carried the faint, practiced weariness of someone addressing a child who has raised the same objection before. She stroked the collar of the coat once more, then folded it carefully over the arm of the chair. Stop being so dramatic about a little money. Mia deserves to have beautiful photographs. That's not something we should be cheap about. It wasn't your money to spend. Sloane picked up her phone from the side table and began scrolling. Talk to your father if it bothers you so much. Clara stood in the doorway for another moment. The rain drummed against the living room window in a steady, relentless rhythm, and the sound of it filled the silence where Sloane's attention had been. Clara looked at the coat on the arm of the chair. She thought about what a coat like that cost, and then she thought about the zero on the 401k statement. And then she thought about the mortgage notice in her bag, 3 months past due, and something cold and precise moved through her chest. She turned and walked back to the kitchen. The pill organizer was on the counter, the one she filled for Arthur every Sunday, 7 compartments. The blood pressure medication and the cholesterol medication and the aspirin, the small, faithful ritual of care she had maintained without being asked and without being thanked. She picked it up and began filling the Thursday compartment, her hands moving from habit while her mind moved elsewhere. Are you even listening to me, Sloane? She said it under her breath, to no one, to the rain, to the window. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. She set the pill organizer down. The silence in the house pressed in around her. It was a particular kind of silence, not empty, but full, weighted with the specific gravity of a household that ran on someone else's effort and acknowledged it only when that effort was interrupted. 4 years. She had been the one keeping the lights on. Literally, she paid the electric bill. She paid the gas. She had quietly covered the mortgage twice in the past year when Arthur had come to her in that particular way. He had, not quite asking, the request implicit in the way he stood in the doorway of her room with the bill in his hand. And a look on his face that mixed resentment with expectation in proportions she had never quite been able to parse. She thought about the number in the emergency account now. The number that should have been $11,200, give or take, which was what it had held as of her last statement. The number that was now $6,700. I am just a walking ATM to them. The thought arrived fully formed, without drama, the way true things sometimes did, not as a revelation, but as a recognition, the acknowledgement of something already known. She stood at the kitchen counter and looked at the rain, tracing its lines down the window glass, and she felt, beneath the exhaustion and the cold precision of her anger, something else. Something quieter. The particular loneliness of a person who has been useful for so long that no one around them remembers to wonder if they are all right. She picked up the pill organizer. She finished filling it. She set it by the sink where Arthur would see it in the morning, the way she always did. Then she got her bag, pulled on her rain jacket, and drove to the trauma center, where people needed her in ways that were at least honest about it. The emergency account withdrawal sat in the back of her mind all day. The way a stone sits in a shoe small enough to almost ignore, but present through every step. Between patients, she ran the numbers quietly. The mortgage arrears, the 401k, the utilities she'd been covering, the grocery runs that she noticed had increased since Sloane had stopped bothering to shop strategically, and the small cash advances she'd spotted on the credit card statement last quarter. The joint card, the one Arthur was supposed to use only for household necessities. The one that had a balance that Clara had been steadily, silently paying down for 18 months. By the time she drove home that evening, the number she had arrived at was not a comfortable one. It had the density of something that had been building for a long time in the dark, accruing interest in more ways than one. She pulled into the driveway and sat with the engine off for her 60 seconds. The house was lit in the windows. The television blue flickered through the living room curtains. The overdue mortgage notice was in her bag. The 401k statement was in her bag. The emergency account balance was in her head. She picked up her bag and went inside. The restaurant was called Meridian, and it was the kind of place where the menu didn't list prices. Clara had known that going in. Arthur had been the one to suggest it had presented the birthday dinner in the particular way he had of presenting things he wanted. As though the decision had already been made and her role was simply to receive it graciously. Somewhere nice, he'd said. For once. The whole family together. Sloane had made the reservation. Mia had posted about it on her Instagram story 48 hours in advance, with a countdown sticker and the caption "Fam dinner incoming." Clara had worked a double shift the day before and spent the morning of the dinner ironing a blouse she hadn't worn in a year. She arrived 5 minutes early. The others were already there. Meridian occupied the top floor of a building on First Avenue, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over Elliott Bay. On a clear night, the view would have been extraordinary. Tonight, the windows reflected the interior of the restaurant back at itself, 40 guests at white-clothed tables. The soft percussion of silverware and conversation, the amber light of candles in glass holders that made everyone look slightly warmer than they were. Clara found the table, kissed Arthur's cheek because she always did, accepted a glass of wine she didn't particularly want, and sat down between a cousin she recognized and a woman she didn't, who turned out to be the girlfriend of one of Arthur's old contracting colleagues. The dinner moved the way formal family dinners moved in courses, with the particular social lubrication of alcohol and occasion, softening the edges of people who might otherwise have had less to say to one another. Clara ate methodically. She asked the colleague's girlfriend about her work. She answered questions about nursing with the practiced brevity of someone who has explained it many times and knows exactly how much detail people actually want. She watched Arthur at the head of the table, expansive and charming in the way he could be when there was an audience laughing too loudly. Refilling glasses he hadn't been asked to refill, performing the ease of a man who had nothing to be anxious about. He was nervous. She could see it under the performance, the way she could see a patient's real pain level beneath their insistence that they were fine. The slight over-precision of his movements. The way his eyes kept moving to Sloane and then away. The too careful way he set down his wineglass each time, as if he was concentrating on not doing it too hard. She was still trying to identify what she was picking up on when Arthur stood up. The table quieted quickly. He was a large man, Arthur Vance, broad-shouldered and gray-haired, with the particular physical authority of someone who had spent decades working with his hands. Even if those hands had been idle for 3 years now, when he stood at the head of a table, people noticed. He lifted his wine glass, and the room's ambient noise dropped another register. "I want to say a few words," he said. His voice carried easily. First to Clara. "Happy birthday, sweetheart." There was a murmur of happy birthdays around the table. Clara lifted her glass slightly in acknowledgement and smiled in the way she'd learned to smile when she needed an expression but not an emotion. 30 years old, Arthur continued. "Time flies. But tonight we're also celebrating something else." He glanced at Mia, who was already leaning forward slightly, phone in hand, held at the angle of someone who has been recording for a few seconds already. "Mia and her young man, they've set a date. Spring. And we want it to be everything she deserves." Applause around the table. Mia smiled the smile of someone who knows they're on camera. "And that brings me to the point," Arthur said. His voice shifted not dramatically, but Clara heard it. The performance remained, but beneath it, the register changed. The ease became something that required more maintenance. Family takes care of family. That's what we do. And Clara, he looked at her directly now, across the table and the candles and the 40 people between them. "We're going to need you to sign over the savings bond. The 52,000. For Mia's wedding." The table did not go silent so much as it went still. There was a difference. Silence was the absence of sound. This was the presence of held breath, of 38 people suddenly unsure where to look. Clara set down her fork. "Arthur," she said quietly. "This isn't the place. It's family." His voice had lifted slightly. Not quite loud enough to be called a scene, but loud enough that anyone who had been holding a private conversation was no longer holding it. "There's no better place than family. That money is mine." Clara kept her voice even. "It has nothing to do with Mia's wedding. You owe this family." The charm had thinned, the way ice thins when the temperature rises. Underneath it, she could see what had always been underneath it, the cold. A movable conviction of a man who had decided long ago what the truth was and had never revisited the decision. "You owe this family your life." His voice was louder now. Distinct. The kind of loud that filled a room with windows overlooking Elliott Bay and 40 people who had stopped pretending to have other places to look. "Your mother died because of you. The least you can do." "Arthur." Her voice was quiet. Completely quiet. "The least you can do is contribute something real to this family, for once in your..." I said no. The words landed in a room that was now entirely silent. 40 people, and not one of them made a sound. The colleague's girlfriend had put her hand over her mouth. The cousin beside Clara was looking at the tablecloth. At the far end of the table, Mia had adjusted the angle of her phone. Arthur's face had gone dark, not flushed, but darkened. The particular color that lived beneath the surface of a man who had not been refused in a long time and had forgotten how to absorb it. His lips were pressed together. His hand around the wineglass was white at the knuckle. "I died inside a long time ago." The thought moved through Clara quietly, the way a current moves beneath still water. She gripped the edge of the white tablecloth with both hands, not dramatically, not visibly. Just the private anchor of a body that knew how to hold itself still in the middle of things falling apart. She could smell the steak going cold on her plate. The candle nearest her guttered slightly in the air from the ventilation system. 40 people staying silent was louder than anything she had heard in the trauma unit. It was louder than alarms and louder than crying and louder than the sound of a monitor flatlining. It pressed against her eardrums and her sternum and the back of her throat, and she held the tablecloth and breathed. "We'll talk at home," she said finally. Her voice gave nothing. She picked up her fork and returned to her food, which was cold now, and ate it carefully, because it was the most dignified thing left to do. Around the table, conversations resumed in the careful, overly deliberate way of people restarting engines after a stall. Someone laughed, slightly too loud, slightly too soon. At the far end of the table, Mia lowered her phone. She looked at her screen for a moment, then looked up with a small, satisfied smile, and typed something Clara couldn't see. She didn't cry until she was home. Not in the car, where she drove the 12 blocks from First Avenue to Halcott Street. With both hands on the wheel and the radio off and the rain making its ordinary river of the street. Not on the porch, where she stood for a moment in the covered dark before putting her key in the lock. Not in the hallway, where she set her bag down beside the mahogany table that still held its tower of sealed envelopes. One more yellow corner still visible behind the stack. She made it to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, still wearing her coat, and then she put her face in her hands and let the evening have her for a few minutes. It wasn't grief, exactly. It wasn't even humiliation, though that was part of it, the particular, corrosive kind that came from being diminished in front of people who had no context for you. Who would carry that single scene away with them and file it somewhere in their understanding of who Clara Vance was? It was something older than humiliation. Something that had been accumulating since long before the restaurant, long before the 401k statement. Or the missing $4,000, long before Arthur had lost his job or Sloane had arrived with her designer receipts and her son's casual certainty that the world owed her comfort. Your mother died because of you. She had heard those words before. Not the first time. Not the 10th. Arthur had first said them to her when she was 11 years old. 3 weeks after the funeral, in a kitchen that had smelled of casserole dishes brought by neighbors and the particular institutional smell of hospital paperwork not yet filed. He had said them in a tone that suggested he was delivering information. Rather than inflicting damage, and for years, for far too many years, Clara had received them the same way. As information. As a fact of the landscape. She stood up. She turned on the lamp on her nightstand. She looked at her room, the room she'd occupied since childhood, the room she paid the mortgage on now. The room that contained a nursing textbook on the desk and a half-finished cup of tea on the nightstand and on the floor, along the wall, stacked in a configuration she'd been meaning to organize, 4 years' worth of household bills she'd been quietly collecting. Utility bills with her name as secondary account holder. Grocery receipts. The mortgage statements with their running balance of what had been paid and by whom. Because Clara had started keeping the copies 3 years ago, not quite knowing why, the same instinct that made her document everything in a patient's chart even when nothing had gone wrong yet. She looked at the boxes. She had never counted the total. She had always meant to and had always, somehow, found reasons not to. She sat down at her desk and turned on her laptop. It took her 40 minutes. She was thorough, because she was always thorough, and because thoroughness was the only form of control available to her at 11:30 on a Wednesday night in a house that smelled of someone else's cooking. And someone else's perfume and the slow, particular rot of money disappearing without explanation. 40 minutes, and a yellow legal pad, and a column of numbers that she added twice to be sure. The total was $134,000. $134,000 in 4 years. Mortgage contributions, utility payments, groceries, Arthur's prescriptions during the months when the insurance gap had left them uncovered, 2 car repairs on vehicles she didn't drive, and 1 emergency room visit for Sloane that had somehow become Clara's responsibility in the chaos of the moment and had never been repaid or acknowledged. $134,000 that had moved from Clara's accounts into the maintenance of a household that contained 3 other adults. None of whom had contributed in any proportional way to its survival. She set the pen down. Then there was a hammering at her door. Clara. Arthur's voice, thick with something wine, probably, and the accumulated pressure of a man who had not gotten what he came for this evening. The door handle rattled. She kept her door locked, had kept it locked for 2 years. Clara, open the door. She didn't move. I know you're in there. A pause. The sound of his breathing, audible even through the wood. You embarrassed this family tonight. You understand that? Standing up in front of everyone and making a scene. I didn't make a scene, she said. Her voice was level. She was still looking at the number on the legal pad. You refused in front of 40 people. The hammering resumed, 3 flat impacts. You're ungrateful. You've always been ungrateful. Everything this family has done for you. She stopped listening, which was a skill she had developed over many years and which required the same focused detachment as any other clinical skill. She let his voice become texture rather than language. And she looked at the number on the legal pad, and she let herself think, clearly and without sentiment, about what the number meant. She got up and went to her closet. On the top shelf, behind a winter sweater she never wore anymore, was a small box. She took it down and sat back on the bed and opened it. And inside, beneath an old birthday card and a photograph she didn't look at directly, was her mother's Medicare card. Patricia Ann Vance. The card had been issued 6 months before she died. Clara had found it in a drawer years ago and kept it without fully knowing why, the same way she'd kept the photograph and the card because her mother had been a person who existed in the world. Who had carried an insurance card in her wallet and had her name printed on it in the particular bureaucratic font of federal documents, and Clara needed. Sometimes, the reminder that the absence had a shape. Arthur's voice had fallen off outside the door. She heard his footsteps move down the hallway. She heard the bedroom door at the end of the hall open and close. She sat on her bed with her mother's Medicare card in her hand. And she thought about the 30 years that had passed since the funeral, 30 years in which Arthur had found new and varied ways to ensure that her mother's death was a story about Clara's culpability. Rather than his own failures, 30 years in which the card in her hand had belonged to a woman who had deserved better from everyone who claimed to love her. Including the man currently sleeping at the end of the hallway. If I was never born, then I shouldn't be the one paying for your life. The thought was not loud. It arrived quietly, with the quality of something that had been waiting patiently to be articulated. Clara turned the Medicare card over in her hands once, then placed it carefully back in the box back on the shelf. She returned to her desk. She looked at the number on the legal pad. $134,000. She picked up the pen and drew a single line beneath the total. The way she'd been taught to finalize a column of figures clean, definitive, the mark that meant the accounting was complete. She turned off the lamp. She lay down on top of the covers, still in her coat, because the house was cold and because she was too tired to do otherwise. Outside, the rain moved against the window in long, slow sheets. She stared at the ceiling. The accounting was complete. What came next would require a different kind of precision entirely. Friends, thank you for staying with us through the first half of Clara's story. We've watched her come home from 16-hour shifts to a house she's been keeping afloat almost entirely on her own. We've seen money disappear without explanation, a public humiliation designed to break her, and a father who has weaponized grief for 30 years. And in that quiet bedroom, surrounded by 4 years of receipts and a total she finally let herself count, we saw something shift in Clara Vance. She isn't broken. She's done. The second half of this story is where everything changes. The past has been building toward something, and so has Clara. Stay with us because the truth that's been buried in this family is about to come to the surface. And the woman who uncovers it has been preparing for this moment longer than she knew. 6 years ago, the hospital room on the 4th floor of Swedish Medical Center had smelled of antiseptic and old flowers. And Iris Calloway had been the smallest Clara had ever seen her. Iris, who had once managed to be simultaneously the most formidable and the most warm-hearted person in any room she entered. Who had grown tomatoes on a 6th-floor balcony out of sheer stubbornness, who had told Clara at the age of 9 that a woman who knew her own mind was worth 10 women who only knew other people's had been diminished by the illness to something that seemed almost impossibly fragile. But her eyes, when Clara sat down beside the bed and took her hand, were completely clear. You look tired, Iris said. You're the one in the hospital, Clara said. A thin smile. Don't deflect. Your mother used to do that. She turned Clara's hand over in both of hers, studying it the way an old woman studies the hands of the young. With the particular attention of someone who knows what hands go through, given enough time. I need you to listen to me, Clara. Not the way you listen to patients. The way you listen to things that matter. I'm listening. Your father, Iris paused. Not from weakness, but from the deliberate weight of choosing words. He has spent 30 years making himself the center of every story. Including your mother's, including yours. She reached beneath the pillow, the motion careful and slow, and withdrew a small brass key on a plain ring. She pressed it into Clara's palm and closed her fingers around it. Safety deposit box. Harborview branch. The account is in your name. Has been for 3 years. Clara looked at the key. The house, Clara. Iris's voice was steady. I'm the one who helped your mother buy it, did you know that? Before she met Arthur. It was hers. And when Arthur lost that job, the second one, the one before this most recent disaster, she came to me frightened. I helped her make arrangements. The clear eyes found Clarice and held them. Don't let him ruin you like he ruined me, Clara. Don't let him make you small. Clara had carried the key home and put it in the small box on the top shelf of her closet, behind the winter sweater she never wore. She had not gone to the bank. Not then. She had told herself she would go when there was a right moment, and the right moment had not come, and 6 years had passed. And Iris had died the following spring, and the key had stayed in the box. She went to the Harborview branch on a Thursday morning, before her shift, in the rain. Genevieve Thorne had been Iris's attorney, and she was a small woman in her late 60s. With silver-framed glasses and the composed, unhurried manner of someone who had delivered difficult truths professionally for decades and had learned that patience was more useful than drama. She met Clara at the branch by prior arrangement, with a folder of documents and a cup of coffee she'd brought from the place next door. Your grandmother was very thorough, Genevieve said. They were seated across from each other at a small table in a private room off the bank's main floor. The safety deposit box sat open between them. Inside documents, neatly organized, the way Iris organized everything. She anticipated that there might be resistance to what she'd arranged. She wanted to make sure you had everything you needed. Clara looked at the documents. The deed to the house on Halcott Street was on top. A legal instrument she had seen only in abstract terms before, the concept of ownership without the physical paper of it. She read her own name on it and felt something move through her chest that she didn't immediately have a word for. When? She asked. The transfer was executed the day Arthur lost his contractor license, Genevieve said. Your mother signed it willingly. She understood what she was doing. A brief pause. He's been living in your house for 11 years, Clara. He knows it, on some level. That's part of what you've been dealing with. The rain pressed against the bank's small window. Clara sat very still with the deed in her hands and thought about the yellow envelope on the mahogany table. The practiced motion of Arthur sliding it behind the tax notices. She thought about the mortgage in her name that she had been paying. She thought about the key, small and brass, that had sat in a box on a closet shelf for 6 years. While she covered utility bills and prescription costs and a $4,000 wedding photography deposit. What do I need to do? She said. Genevieve opened her folder. She did not act in anger. That was the thing she was most careful about. She had seen what anger produced, in the trauma unit and outside of it. Anger was fast and loud, and it left damage in patterns that were hard to repair. What she felt in the days after her meeting with Genevieve was not anger, exactly. It was colder than that. More architectural. It had the quality of a plan being assembled from components that had been lying around for years, waiting for someone to recognize them for what they were. She started small. On a Monday morning, she called the credit card company and removed herself as the primary payment guarantor on the joint household card. The customer service representative was efficient and pleasant, and the call took 11 minutes. She then logged into her bank's mobile app and changed her direct deposit destination from the joint household checking account to a new individual account she had opened the previous Thursday at a different institution entirely. One that had no existing relationship with any account Arthur or Sloane held. The new account was at a credit union in Capitol Hill. Clara had chosen it specifically because it was not a bank she had ever mentioned to anyone in the house on Halcott Street. She moved her emergency fund the same day. The what remained of it, after the photography deposit, she transferred it to the new account in a single transaction. In the evenings, she sat at her desk and organized the 4 years of documentation she'd been keeping along her bedroom wall. She had always been methodical about the physical copies, but she hadn't been systematic about them in a meaningful way. Hadn't collated them by category or cross-referenced the amounts against the mortgage statements to demonstrate the pattern clearly. She did that now. Bank statements, mortgage payment receipts, each one with her account number clearly visible in the transaction record. Utility payment confirmations, pharmacy receipts for Arthur's prescriptions with her debit card number printed at the bottom. She used a yellow highlighter for amounts over $500 and a blue one for recurring monthly payments, and by the time she was done, the highlighted totals told a story that was completely unambiguous and entirely documented. $134,000. Over 4 years. Fully evidenced. She called Genevieve on a Wednesday evening and described what she'd assembled. "That's more thorough than I expected," Genevieve said, which Clara took as the professional compliment it was intended to be. "What's the next step?" "I file the formal ownership notice with the county assessor's office," Genevieve said. "That's already underway. I submitted the deed transfer documentation last week. Once that's confirmed in the county record, you'll have the standing to serve notice to vacate. Do you have someone who can be present when you do that?" "Given the circumstances, I'd recommend it." "What kind of someone?" "Law enforcement, ideally. It's a civil matter, not criminal, but having an officer present tends to manage the temperature of the conversation." A pause. "I can arrange to be there as well." "With the documentation?" "Yes," Clara said. "Let's do that." She hung up and sat for a moment at her desk in the quiet of her room. Through the floor, she could hear the television in the living room. The familiar ambient noise of a household that had organized itself around her absence, her funding, her silence. Sloane was probably on the couch, her phone in one hand and a glass of something in the other. Mia might be there, or might be in her room, producing content for an audience that had no idea what was happening in the house that provided the backdrop for her carefully curated life. Arthur would be in his chair, the one nearest the window, his large hands folded in his lap, watching something that wasn't what he was really thinking about. Clara folded the highlighted documentation into a manila envelope, a plain one, not yellow, chosen without particular intention, but noted with the faint, wry awareness that she was filing her own envelope on the same mahogany table where his had sat. She put on her rain jacket and drove across the city. The lights at the house on Halcott Street came on as she was pulling away, the ordinary illumination of an early evening. Living room, kitchen, the amber glow of the upstairs hallway. She watched them in the rearview mirror for a moment. She had called the utility company that morning. Formally, as the account holder, the name had been in her name all along. She realized, reviewing the original setup paperwork, because she was the one who had called to establish service when Arthur's account had been flagged for an unpaid balance at the previous address. She had asked them to process the termination of service for the Halcott Street address, effective in 72 hours. She watched the lights in the rearview mirror until she turned the corner and they disappeared. 3 days later, she sat in her car across the street, engine off, and watched the house go dark. Not all at once. First the kitchen, then after a gap during which she imagined the brief, confused scramble for flashlights. The checking and rechecking of the circuit breaker, the living room. Then the upstairs hallway. Then the last light, which was the lamp in the room Arthur and Sloane shared, and which went out with the finality of a period at the end of a sentence. The Seattle fog moved through the street, slow and indifferent. Clara sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the dark house and felt the fire of something, not triumph. Not yet, but the particular warmth of a resolve that had been cold for a long time and was finally running at temperature moved steadily through her. She had $134,000 in documentation in a manila envelope. She had a deed in her name in Genevieve's files. She had a new account at a credit union in Capitol Hill with a balance that was entirely, completely, documentably hers. She had, she realized, been preparing for this for 4 years without knowing it. The receipts along the wall. The copies she kept. The way she'd always paid with traceable methods. Debit card, bank transfer, never cash, as though some part of her had known that the record would matter eventually. There was one more thing to do. She started the engine and drove home to the small, furnished studio she'd signed the lease on 3 days ago, in a building near the water, with large windows and a balcony that faced east. The dinner was by candlelight. Not by choice, by necessity, because the power had been off for 4 days. And the utility company had not received a reinstatement request because no reinstatement request had been filed. Arthur had called them twice. Both times he had been told that the account holder had requested the termination. and that any reinstatement would need to come from the account holder directly. Both times he had been transferred and put on hold and eventually disconnected, and both times he had come downstairs with a particular expression on his face. The expression of a man who is beginning to understand something he is not yet ready to admit he understands. Sloane had bought pillar candles from the drugstore. They stood in clusters on the kitchen table and the kitchen counter, and in their light. The house had a warmth it hadn't had in years, a purely physical warmth, the warmth of combustion, which had nothing to do with comfort. The food was things that didn't require the stove: crackers, deli meat, a container of soup that Sloane had heated on the camp stove Arthur dug out of the garage, the one he'd used for camping trips he'd taken before Clara was born and which smelled of old fuel and more innocent times. Mia was on her phone, trying for a cellular signal that kept dropping. She had a ring light battery powered on the counter and had been making content about the power outage, authentic off-grid energy. She'd captioned one video, which had received more comments than she expected, few of them sympathetic. Clara arrived at 7:15. She knocked. She had a key, still it was, technically, her house, but she knocked anyway, because she was not here to enter like a family member. She was here for something else entirely. Arthur opened the door. He was holding a candle, and in its light his face was all shadows and the heavy, unreadable quality of a man who has been waiting for something without knowing exactly what he's been waiting for. "Clara," he said. And then, because he was still Arthur Vance and the performance was still available to him, "Come in. We should talk." "Yes," she said, "we should." She stepped inside. The house smelled of candle wax and deli mustard and the cold that had been seeping in since the heat went off along with everything else. The mahogany table in the entryway caught her eye, still covered with its tower of envelopes. The yellow corner still visible, an artifact of a discovery that now felt like it had happened to a different version of herself. She set her bag on the table and removed from it a single document. White paper, clean type, notarized with the blue stamp of the county assessor's office. "This is a notice to vacate," she said. She placed it on the table in the space between the sealed envelopes. "You have 30 days. Arthur's face did not move for a moment. Then it moved all at once, the color, the set of the jaw, the particular widening of the eyes that preceded what Clara had come to think of as his assembly, the rapid construction of the version of the situation that suited him best. "What in the what is this? What are you?" "The house is mine, Arthur." She kept her voice at the same register she used in the trauma unit, calm, certain. The voice of someone who has already accounted for the chaos and is not surprised by it. "It's been mine for 11 years. Grandma Iris arranged it with Mom before she died. The deed was transferred to my name the day you lost your contractor license." Sloane appeared in the kitchen doorway, a candle in her hand and her face wearing an expression Clara had not seen on it before, something unguarded. Something close to fear stripped of its social costume. "You can't do this," Arthur said. His voice had dropped, which was somehow worse than when it rose. "This is my house. I've lived here I have the deed." Clara reached into her bag and produced the second document, Genevieve's copy, the one with the full chain of title clearly laid out. "I also have 4 years of bank records showing $134,000 in contributions from my accounts to this household's expenses. That documentation is with my attorney." "Your attorney?" Arthur's jaw worked. "Since when do you have an attorney?" "Since I needed one." He took a step toward her, not threateningly, exactly, but with the mass and momentum of a large man who was accustomed to his physical presence solving problems. "Clara, listen to me. You are going to." The knock at the door was brisk and professional. 2 beats. Clara opened it. Genevieve Thorne stood on the porch in a rain jacket, silver-framed glasses slightly fogged from the cold, a folder of documents under one arm, and beside her, a uniformed officer from the Seattle Police Department who was young and composed and who looked at Arthur Vance with the particular expression of someone who has been briefed on the situation and is here to ensure that it resolves within the parameters of the law. "Mr. Vance," Genevieve said, with the measured courtesy of someone who does not require a warm welcome to do her job. "I'm Genevieve Thorne, attorney for Clara Vance. I have the recorded deed transfer and the notice to vacate, both properly executed. The officer is here as a courtesy to ensure the evening proceeds without incident." She looked at Arthur steadily. "I'd suggest you take a look at the documents." Arthur took the folder. He stood in the candlelit foyer of a house that no longer belonged to him and opened the folder and read, and whatever remained of the performance fell away. Mia had come out of the kitchen. She was standing in the hallway with her phone in her hand, the ring light casting its flat, commercial brightness across the scene. She was not recording. For once, she was not recording. Today, Clara said, the law finally recognized the owner of this house. And it's not the man who spent 20 years trying to erase me. The words were quiet. They didn't need volume. They had the particular weight of something that had been true for a long time and was being spoken in the correct room for the first time. Sloane's composure had dissolved entirely. She stood in the kitchen doorway with her candle and her designer sweater and her face bare of its management expression. And she looked, Clara thought, very tired. Very tired and very much like someone who had been operating a particular scheme for a very long time and had just realized the scheme was over. The 30 days passed without incident. The officer returned twice, at Clara's request, to ensure the process was orderly. Sloane made one phone call to a lawyer she couldn't ultimately afford to retain. Arthur made no calls that Clara was aware of. Mia packed her ring light and her garment bags and her cardboard boxes of brand scent products, and loaded them into a car driven by someone Clara didn't recognize. On the last day, Arthur stood in the foyer for a long time before he walked out. Clara was not there to see it. She had been told about it afterward, how he had stood very still in the candlelit hallway. Even though the power had been reinstated 3 weeks prior and there were no candles anymore, as though he was marking something, or couldn't quite make himself move. And then he had walked out of the door, and Genevieve had filed the final paperwork. And the house on Halcott Street was, in every legal and practical and personal sense, Clara Vance's. The new apartment was on the 4th floor of a building near the water, in a neighborhood that smelled of salt, air and coffee and the particular industrial organic combination of a working waterfront and the restaurants and galleries that had grown up alongside it. It was small. 1 bedroom, a kitchen with a gas range that worked, a living room with enough space for a couch and a bookcase, and a balcony that faced east. Clara had been deliberate about the east-facing balcony. She worked nights enough to know the value of a sunrise you could actually see. She had moved in on a Saturday. She had done it herself, with 2 colleagues from the trauma unit who had brought coffee and a rented van and had asked no questions beyond, "Where does this go?" And, "Do you want the desk by the window?" which was one of the reasons she valued them. By evening the boxes were in and the bed was assembled and she was sitting on her balcony with a mug of chamomile. The same kind she'd been making in the Halcott Street kitchen for 4 years, watching the lights come on across the water. She had called Genevieve the following week to discuss the house. The options were what they were: keep it, rent it, sell it. The mortgage was in her name and the payments were current, had always been current. And the property had appreciated since her grandmother and mother had first acquired it. Clara had sat with the numbers and thought about it carefully, the way she thought about all things she needed to decide. And then she had called Genevieve back and said she wanted to rent it. "Not to them," she said. "Of course not," Genevieve said. The first tenants moved in the following month. A young couple, both teachers, who had been looking for something in the neighborhood for a year and had nearly given up. They sent her a note after the first week to say the maple tree in the front yard was beautiful. Clara stood on her balcony with her coffee one morning about 6 weeks after the move, watching the light come up over the East Hills, the particular Seattle dawn that arrived more like a slow brightening than a sunrise. The gray lifting gradually into something warmer, the water below the building going from black to silver to blue. She was in her robe. She had worked a night shift and come home at 7 and not been able to sleep, and instead of fighting it she had made coffee and come out here. Which was what she did now when sleep didn't come. She had learned to stop fighting the things that didn't come when you called them. Her phone buzzed. She picked it up. The text was from Arthur. She read the sender's name before she read the message, and there was a moment, brief, involuntary, of the old reflex. The one that had taken 30 years to build and would take some time yet to fully dismantle. The brace, the intake of breath, the preparation for whatever shape the demand would take. Then she read the message. It was 3 sentences. The words "sorry" and "I was wrong" and something about the grandchildren he was hoping to have someday. Which she read as a bid for a future she was not being asked about. She read it once, in full, because she was not the kind of person who made decisions without complete information. Then she deleted it. She set the phone face down on the arm of the balcony chair and picked up her coffee and looked at the water. There was no dramatic internal monologue about it. No long reckoning, no weighing of forgiveness against its absence. It was simply that she had accounted for the past very thoroughly. Had numbered its costs, had documented its architecture, had sat in a bank office with a brass key in her hand. And let herself finally see the shape of what had been arranged on her behalf before she was old enough to understand that arrangement and the accounting was complete. The line was drawn beneath the total. What she was building now was a different ledger entirely, and it had no column for that particular entry. She had signed the new mortgage paperwork, her own apartment, a 20-year fixed rate, the monthly payment. Something she could absorb on her own income without adjusting anything else. She had signed it at a desk in a credit union office with a notary and a loan officer who had been pleasant and professional. And she had noticed, in the signing, that her hand did not shake. It had always shaken, a little, when she signed things. Since childhood, a slight tremor, not visible in clinical work where steadiness was required, but there in ordinary moments. The first time she'd ever signed a lease, at 22. Her first apartment out of nursing school, her hand had trembled enough that she'd apologized to the landlord, who had waved it off and handed her the keys. She had attributed it to excitement at the time. She understood now that it had been something else, the background static of living in a constant low-level state of anticipated wrong, waiting for the thing she'd missed, the bill she hadn't covered, the way she'd failed without yet knowing it. The hand that signed the new mortgage was steady. She looked at the signature afterward, her full name in her ordinary handwriting. Nothing remarkable about it, just ink on a page, and she held the image for a moment before the notary moved to collect it. At 30, I finally learned that family isn't a debt you pay, it's a choice you make. The rain had stopped sometime in the night. She hadn't noticed when she'd been working, or sleeping the few hours she'd managed, or moving through the small rituals of her new morning routine. In a kitchen that smelled of her own coffee and her own choice of dish soap and nothing else. But standing on the balcony in the early light, she could feel the difference the rain's absence made in the air, a clarity. A quality of clean that Seattle had, sometimes, in the gaps between storms. The salt smell off the water. The faint warmth beginning to come into the light. She stayed on the balcony until her coffee was gone and the sun had fully cleared the hills, turning the water below from silver to a clean, flat blue. Then she went inside and went to bed, and for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, she slept without listening for anything. Friends, how did Clara's story sit with you today? I've been thinking about it since we started, and I keep coming back to one image. A young woman in a dark bedroom, surrounded by 4 years of bills she'd been paying in silence, finally allowing herself to count the total. $134,000. And the thing that strikes me isn't the number, it's the fact that she kept every receipt. Not because she was planning something. Just because some part of her knew that the truth would matter eventually, and she wanted to be ready. That's not revenge. That's self-respect, maintained quietly, over a very long time, under very difficult conditions. Clara's story is about something most of us have navigated in some form. The particular burden of the person in a family who keeps things running, who covers the gaps, who absorbs the criticism and the blame and goes back to work the next morning anyway. The one who is told, explicitly or implicitly, that their love is a debt to be called in. And what Clara teaches us is that you are allowed to stop paying a debt you never owed. You are allowed to look at the total, draw the line, and say this is where the old accounting ends. We all face moments where we have to choose who we are. Where we have to decide whether the story we've been handed about ourselves. The one that says we owe, that we're responsible, that we caused the damage we've spent our whole lives trying to repair is actually true. Clara looked at that story, found the receipts that told a different one, and chose herself. I hope this story brought you a little comfort today. I hope it reminded you that a fresh start is possible at any age, in any season, even in a city where the rain doesn't stop for weeks at a time. And I hope that somewhere, you recognized a piece of yourself in Clara. The part that keeps going, that keeps documenting, that keeps the key on the shelf even when the right moment hasn't come yet. It comes. Eventually, it comes. If this story moved you, if it made you think of someone, or something, or reminded you of your own moment of drawing the line, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and hit that like button. It means more than you know, and good things have a way of coming back to the people who put good things out into the world. Thank you for being here. Until next time, take care of yourselves.